There are moments in life that are not meant to be remembered, but to awaken. The story you're about to hear is one of those moments. His name is Daniel Fisher, born and raised in a closed-off religious community where absolute obedience to rules was believed to be the only path to salvation. No electricity, no cars, no connection to the outside world, just silence, strict regulations, and fear. Daniel believed that if he followed the laws closely enough, he would be accepted by God. But then, a sudden accident shattered everything he thought he knew. He died, and in the split second between life and death, Daniel met Jesus. That encounter was unlike any sermon he had ever heard, and what Jesus revealed to him about faith, about love, and about the true worth of the human soul is something you will never forget. If you've ever felt like you're trying too hard to be accepted, if you've ever wondered, does God really love me? Then don't look away from this video. Hit the subscribe button and watch until the end, because what you're about to hear might be exactly what your soul has been waiting for. Daniel Fisher remembers that morning vividly. There was nothing outwardly different, but inside, he carried a storm of emotions he didn't dare name. He was driving his buggy slowly down the familiar roads back home, weighed down by questions he had never dared speak aloud. Are all these rules I follow really enough to please God? Or am I just repeating old patterns without ever truly knowing who He is when the accident happened? It was too fast to process. A truck came barreling around a blind curve and slammed directly into Daniel's buggy. In an instant, all sound disappeared. He felt no pain, just emptiness. When Daniel opened his eyes, he knew he was no longer in the world he once knew. There was no light, no time, just a thick, pitch-black space. As if all existence had been erased. He didn't see God. He didn't see heaven. He only saw himself bare, exposed, with nothing left to cling to. Then, the visions began like scenes from a film reel of his life. Daniel saw himself working in the fields, attending worship services, reading the Bible. On the surface, everything looked right. But the longer he watched, the clearer one chilling truth became. Everything he had done came from fear, not from love. Then, deeper memories began to surface, moments where Daniel had unknowingly hurt others through his religious pride. He saw himself judging those who were weaker, mocking those who dared question tradition, believing he was more spiritual simply because he followed the rules more strictly. Daniel had never realized that obedience without love could become a spiritual prison, not just for himself, but for others too. He felt a crushing weight, as if the darkness around him was swallowing his soul whole. In that moment, Daniel collapsed and whispered through his tears, "Lord, if you're real, please save me. I don't want to die in this emptiness." And then the light appeared, small at first, like a candle flickering in the abyss, but gradually it expanded, pushing the darkness back. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt something he had never truly known: hope. This light wasn't like any light Daniel had ever seen. It didn't blind him, but it made everything heavy in his soul begin to melt away. And then he saw him. No introduction needed, no title required. Daniel's soul instantly recognized it was Jesus. Daniel had heard about Jesus his whole life, but now, standing before him in this sacred realm, he knew no sermon, no tradition had ever truly captured who he is. His eyes were full of majesty, yet overflowing with love. And when Jesus looked at him, Daniel felt something he had never experienced in all his years of strict religious observance. He was known truly and still loved. No accusations, no list of sins. Just one question, yet it pierced straight through his soul. Why do you trust the work of your hands instead of trusting my love? Daniel couldn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew all too well. His entire life had been spent trying to earn heaven-keeping rules, living simply, obeying every detail of the Ordnung, the strict code of Amish life. But he had never truly surrendered his soul to the Savior. He had lived inside religion, but had never stepped into relationship. In that light, Daniel saw clearly salvation is not a reward for the righteous. It is a gift freely given, never earned. Jesus didn't rebuke him. He sat beside Daniel, gently placed his hand on his shoulder, and his words etched themselves deep into the core of Daniel's being. You are loved, not because you are good enough. You are loved because I am love. A wave of warmth flooded through Daniel's spiritual body. He felt the years of striving, tension, and fear melt away like snow under sunlight. He wept not out of shame, but because, for the first time, he was free. Jesus continued, "True faith doesn't begin with law-keeping. It begins with surrendering the heart. No one enters my kingdom because they did everything right. They enter because I know them, and they know me." Daniel understood. The years behind him weren't meaningless, but they weren't complete. Now, he was being invited into what was real. And when Jesus extended his hand, inviting Daniel to rise, it wasn't just symbolic. It was a beginning. Salvation doesn't come from effort. It comes from a person, Jesus. Daniel stood there, in that sacred light, as images of his past drifted before his eyes like a slow-motion film. He saw himself at 10 years old, trembling as he memorized the community rules so he wouldn't disappoint God. He saw his stern father saying, "If you stray from the law, you won't be saved." Every scene, every sound, every gaze they appeared not to accuse, but to illuminate. Daniel had been taught about a God based on fear, not on love. Jesus said, "You are not alone. Millions are living the same way, obeying to be loved, instead of living from the love they've already been given. His voice was sorrowful, but not weak. It thundered gently through Daniel's soul. That is not the gospel. That is a burden. Daniel could hardly breathe. His entire life, he had believed that if he was good enough, humble enough, diligent enough, salvation would eventually come as a reward. But now, standing in the presence of the one who had been crucified for him, Daniel finally understood salvation is not a reward for the worthy. It is blood already shed, already finished. Jesus said, "The law is only a mirror to show you that you need me, but you've stared at the mirror for so long, you forgot to turn to me." Daniel saw himself in thousands of church gatherings where people heard the Bible, yet still lived in shame. He saw loved ones silently collapsing under the pressure of never being enough. He saw those who had been cast out simply for asking, "Are we living for the law or for God?" And then a scene appeared that made Daniel shiver. A brother from the community, one who had been excommunicated for marrying outside the Amish, praying alone in the night. And Jesus was right there, comforting him with pure, unshakable love. Daniel choked through his tears. "Lord, I judged what I didn't understand. I thought I was keeping the law for you. But in truth, I was afraid of losing my place. Jesus said I did not die for you to live in fear. I died so you could be called my child, not because of merit, but because of unconditional love." Then he stepped closer, his radiant hand resting on Daniel's chest, right where fear had taken root for a lifetime. He spoke, "From now on, you don't live to be saved. You live because you are saved." The light around Jesus continued to shine like a fire that didn't burn warm, yet so powerful it made Daniel's soul tremble. There was no need for further explanation, because in his very presence, every question that had tormented Daniel's mind simply disappeared. The Lord spoke, his voice flowing like water through stone. "You will return, not to become a preacher, but to become an awakening, not with authority, but with love, not with argument, but with what you have seen." Daniel bowed his head, tears streaming endlessly. He didn't want to leave this place, the only place he had ever felt truly loved, without having to earn it. But the Lord came closer, placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. A wave of peace surged directly into his heart. "This is not a reward, Daniel. This is a calling. You are not to preach religion. You are to proclaim grace." Everything began to fade. The light softened, like a page folding shut. Daniel felt himself being pulled back away from the light, away from the peace returning to the still. Broken body lying far below. He woke to the blare of ambulance sirens, the sound of CPR, and his mother's trembling hand clutching his. The hospital lights were harsh. The antiseptic air was sharp. Everything felt unfamiliar, but Daniel was no longer the same. He didn't speak for the first 3 days. He only prayed silently and wrote down every image he had seen, as if afraid he'd lose even a fragment of that heavenly place. Then the day came, the day he chose to speak the truth. He began with his own family. Around the same old wooden table, his father, the same man who once said, "To doubt is sin," looked at him with suspicion as Daniel shared about meeting the Lord, about the truth that grace doesn't require the law to validate it. "Daniel," his father said, "you're speaking like someone who's abandoned the faith." He replied calmly, "Father, I haven't abandoned the faith. I'm just stepping into the part that's real." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some brothers in the community turned their backs on him. A few whispered, "He's been influenced by the world." But among them there were also tearful eyes, his mother, his sister, the elderly neighbor who had long felt invisible after years of silently obeying the rules. Daniel didn't preach. He simply shared through the eyes that had seen the light, through a heart once crushed by fear, now being reborn in love. Daniel knew the time would come when he had to speak out, no longer a whisper in a hospital room, no longer a quiet confession among family, but a public voice in a community where change was feared and difference often labeled as heresy. After many nights of prayer, he uploaded his first video. No theatrics, no sensationalism. Just him sitting in a humble wooden room with steady eyes and a calm, slow voice. "My name is Daniel. I used to believe that perfect obedience to the law was what saved me. But then I died, and I met Jesus. He didn't ask if I had kept all the rules. He asked me, 'Why didn't you trust in my grace?' At first, only a few dozen views, then a few hundred. But comments began to pour in quiet messages from people within the community. I've doubted too, but never dared to say it. Am I a sinner for being exhausted by the need to be perfect? Your story made me cry, because I saw myself in that same darkness. But it didn't take long for the backlash to arrive. A letter was sent to Daniel's home, polite in tone, but cold in spirit. "Dear Daniel Fisher, we have been informed that you are spreading messages that contradict the traditions and foundational beliefs of our community. We request that you cease sharing these personal accounts that may cause confusion and division." Daniel wasn't angry, nor was he surprised. A week later, he was summoned before the church council, the same men he had once called brothers in faith. "Daniel," one of the elders spoke up, "you're leading others away from obedience. You speak too much about grace without mentioning responsibility." Daniel looked them straight in the eye. "I don't deny the law, but I no longer worship the law. I worship the one who gave grace beyond all human effort." No one replied, but the silence spoke louder than any accusation. The following week, Daniel's name was removed from the worship roster. He was asked not to speak during gatherings. Some families who had once been close began to avoid him, but something else also began to happen. There were still eyes that quietly found him in the silence, eyes filled with the same longing to be loved unconditionally. Daniel did not grow discouraged. He knew human rejection is not always proof that I'm wrong. Sometimes, it's simply the sign that light has begun to shine in a place long familiar with darkness. That night, Daniel sat alone in the old barn behind his house. The air wasn't cold, yet he shivered. Not from the wind, but from the loneliness sinking into his bones, like an invisible breeze that cut through flesh and marrow. "Lord, are you sure I'm not lost?" he whispered. He had lost much: the respect of those closest to him, the familiar nods in church, the warm handshakes after worship. All of it seemed to have vanished not through accusation, but through silence and forgetting. And doubt began to creep in. Not doubt in God, but doubt in himself. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe I am prideful. Just like they said. Maybe I just want attention. Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. Daniel bent over on the barn floor, heart pounding. He had no words left for prayer, only a silent, strangled cry in his throat. God, if I've been mistaken, stop me. But if I haven't, please don't stay silent. And he did not stay silent. In the very moment Daniel was ready to give up, a soft wind with no traceable source brushed across his cheek. There was no blinding light, no thunder, but Daniel knew he was not alone. A voice stirred, not loud, but powerful enough to shake his entire soul. "Daniel, you think loneliness means failure, but it is the place where I teach you to hear me most clearly." Daniel looked up. He saw no form, but the presence was undeniable, like an invisible hearth burning in the middle of a frozen night. "You were not wrong to speak. Truth always wounds those who live in lies. But do not be afraid. I did not make a mistake when I chose you. Their rejection does not ruin my plan. On the contrary, it confirms that what you speak has the power to awaken." Tears streamed down Daniel's face for the first time, not from pain, but from confirmation. You may lose a community, but you will not lose me. You don't need their approval to continue. You only need me. A peace flooded his chest like warm water melting ice from the inside out. Daniel stood up, no longer like a man who had been crushed, but like a messenger newly commissioned. That night, he returned home not to seek the approval of men, but to continue the journey even if lonely with no more doubt. Since that night, Daniel no longer sought approval. He began seeking those who quietly longed for what he himself had once lacked: a living faith unchained from rigid laws and lifeless traditions. At first, he shared quietly. A casual conversation with an old friend out in the fields. A gentle word while fixing a neighbor's wagon. No preaching, no persuading, just sharing like offering a small lantern into the darkness. But even a small light is enough for weary eyes to see again. One evening, a widowed mother came to his home. She told him she no longer believed she was loved by God. Daniel simply listened. No formula, no sermon, just a testimony. I used to feel the same way. But then Jesus stepped in. She wept, and from that night on, she began to pray again for the first time in years. Then came a teenager, the quiet one at church, often labeled as a problem. He whispered to Daniel, "I used to think I wasn't good enough. But when I heard you speak, I started to think maybe God doesn't hate me." Daniel embraced him, said nothing, but felt part of a chain break off someone's soul. No one officially recognized this little group. They had no sign, no building of their own. They were ordinary people, but their eyes were starting to shine. Fear was beginning to fade. In hushed gatherings in barns, forest clearings, or Daniel's own kitchen they prayed, not with rituals, but with tears and gratitude. Rumors spread. Some elders grew suspicious. Warnings were issued. Daniel was monitored. Anonymous notes appeared at his door. Stop or leave. But the light had already been lit, and no one could extinguish it. Daniel knew. This was no longer just his story. It was the story of a generation stepping out of the shadows of dead religion and into a living relationship with the Eternal One. One night, during a quiet prayer gathering, a 9-year-old boy suddenly said, "I don't understand everything, but I feel like God is here." The room fell still, and someone whispered, "We don't need to understand everything. We just need to recognize Him." Yet the deeper Daniel walked into this journey, the more he felt the crushing weight of loneliness. Many nights he lay awake, his heart crying out into the silence, "Lord, I'm doing this for you, but why do I feel so alone?" The criticism, the coldness of old friends, the fortress of doubt pressing in. Daniel had nearly fallen silent until, once again, the light returned to his dark room. Jesus appeared not with thunder or miracles, but with an undeniable presence. He said nothing at first. He simply walked over, placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, and said, "I didn't choose you because you were strong. I chose you because you were willing to go when others turned away." And in that moment, the fire in Daniel's heart was reignited not with emotion, but with holy conviction. So if you're hearing these words, this isn't just Daniel's story. This might be your call too. Maybe you've also been suffocated by fear, by religion, by teachings that convinced you you were never enough to be loved by God. But Daniel is proof grace doesn't come to the perfect. It comes to the surrendered. You don't need all the answers. You just need the courage to say, "I'm willing." And when you do, like Daniel, you will never walk alone again. Remember, salvation is not found in rules. It begins at the moment you meet him and dare to follow that light, even when the world doesn't understand. You've heard the story. Now, how will you live the next chapter?